Did you play the game of Risk the board game Risk? Okay, so the board game Risk really is a marvelous model of how Washington thinking is. You have the map of the world, and the aim of the game is to have your piece on every space of the world. And as you move forward, if you're successful and your armies are advancing into new territory, every new territory you have has borders with the enemy. And suddenly, every new border becomes the conflict zone. Every new border becomes vital for your national security. And so you have to have every space on the board, or suddenly you're at risk. Now, American strategists get this or behave this way. I think it's mind-boggling, because we shouldn't be playing a game of Risk where you're trying to conquer the world. But this is the American strategist approach. And a good example of it is the Solomon Islands. Tiny islands, 3,200 kilometers off the coast of Australia, that had the audacity to sign a security pact with China. And suddenly, the United States and Australia are in a tizzy. How dare they? This is a threat to security. And you hear the voices in the U.S. Congress, completely unacceptable that there's a security pact, because you give China 1 inch, they'll take the world. But when the United States says, NATO should enlarge to Georgia and Ukraine, and Russia says, no, that's a security concern, we laugh. We say, why is it a security concern? We're peace-loving, we're wonderful, and that's their choice. That's not our choice. We didn't say, well, that's the Solomon Islands' choice. We dispatched the deputy of the National Security Council to Asia on an urgent mission to express the U.S. displeasure at the Solomon Islands' decision to enter this pact with China. So much, Rob, comes from the unwillingness to really have rules that apply to yourself as well as to others, or to think empathetically. What is the other side thinking? And it comes back, by the way, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think we should talk about that because it's absolutely relevant. When Khrushchev put the nuclear or the atomic weapons in Cuba, all of Kennedy's advisors, except Adlai Stevenson, said from the start, you must attack and take them out. We need a military operation. Many things can be said about that, but I think the bottom line is it would have started World War III because the CIA had every fact wrong. It thought that the missiles were not yet operational. It completely underestimated, roughly by a factor of 7, how many Soviet troops were actually in Cuba, how many would be killed in a military operation, and so forth. Kennedy did a remarkable thing. He kept asking one question. What is in Khrushchev's mind? What is he thinking? In other words, Kennedy behaved empathetically. It didn't mean he sympathized with Khrushchev. He was thinking, what is Khrushchev thinking? What is his point of view? Does he want war? What is he trying to prove? Kennedy had to learn, actually, the details that there were U.S. missiles in Turkey. What are they? Why are they there? Who put them there? And so on. But by the second week of the crisis, Kennedy realized Khrushchev didn't want war, but he did want to put America's face in it, because the U.S. had its Turkish missiles, or its missiles in Turkey pointed right on the border of the Soviet Union. The U.S. had invaded Cuba in the Bay of Pigs operation and so forth. Kennedy realized, you know what? We got to get out of this by a compromise. You remove your missiles, we remove our missiles. We commit never to to invade Cuba again. And that's how the crisis was resolved. It wasn't, we demand victory because Khrushchev has done the most dastardly deed, so we must defeat that man, which is the rhetoric that we have today. Must defeat Putin with his 1,600 active nuclear warheads. We must defeat Putin. This is mind-boggling that even on an anniversary like this, 60 years anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're not taking care to learn the real lessons of how you diffuse a crisis. And you start with empathy. You say, if we care about the Solomon Islands, maybe Russia cares about Ukraine and Georgia in the same way. Maybe we shouldn't be quite so provocative. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about humiliating defeat and so forth. Or maybe we shouldn't be saying this is the worst crime in modern history when the United States is engaged in so many wars of choice. And maybe we should find a way for both sides to stand down.
Yeah. Well, I remember reading Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine.
Absolutely.
About that there were many nuclear weapons inside of submarines off the coast of Cuba, and we started dropping depth charges on them. But for, I can't remember the gentleman's name, who overruled firing the missiles, they were terrified. They're underwater, and the depth charges are going off trying to essentially kill them all and drown them all.
Absolutely right.
And this guy wouldn't allow the missiles to be shot. But it's that close. It's that close to extermination.
So reading list for everybody listening, Daniel Ellsberg, The Doomsday Machine, and Martin Sherwin, Gambling with Armageddon, which is the finest book ever written about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Martin Sherwin tells this story that you're so importantly referring to, Rob. And I think it has many lessons. But what happened is, even after Kennedy and Khrushchev had agreed on the way out, a disabled Soviet submarine in the Caribbean that was out of radio contact, so it had no news, was disabled. It was overheating. It needed to surface just to breathe. Sailors were fainting, and it started to surface, and a jackass in the U.S. Air Force, instead of dropping depth charges, dropped live hand grenades on the submarine as a joke. And he's, we'll scare the hell out of them. So the commander of the vessel ordered a nuclear-tipped submarine to be put into the a nuclear-tipped torpedo to be put into the torpedo bay and called for its launch. And it happened by coincidence that a Soviet party official, a Communist Party official, was on that vessel named Antipov. And he had the ability to override the order of the skipper of the submarine. And he said, no, we're going to surface. We're not going to fire this. And under U.S. military doctrine, described by Ellsberg and by Sherwin, if the U.S. was attacked by a nuclear weapon, even a nuclear-tipped submarine, our military doctrine said we would unleash the full-scale response of a complete attack on the Soviet Union, China, and all of the other countries of the Soviet system. And the estimate was 700 million dead. But what they didn't know was about nuclear winter, because such an attack could have ended life, human life on the planet. We came within seconds of this. We're stupid if we think that things can't get out of hand. Today, I read about a U.S. general saying, well, we may need to break the Soviet blockade of the port of Odessa to let Ukrainian grain supplies. I'm sick of these generals telling us about things that are so unbelievably risky without a proper public debate and understanding. because we could end up in nuclear war. And this is mind-boggling that we are having generals opine on these kinds of military operations, which would be tantamount to direct U.S. war with Russia in this kind of way.
And you're talking about the extermination of life on Earth. I mean, these are not rumors. I've seen in Nature and Science magazine studies of what happens to the upper atmosphere if there's a nuclear exchange. And I encourage many people now. I've been doing a little bit of work with a group called the Quincy Institute, Andrew Basevich.
Excellent. Yep.
Hartung in this group, and exploring some of the ramifications for how our military decisions are being made. And it's really quite haunting to try to understand this dynamic as having anything to do with representing the well-being of America or mankind. And
I learned in thinking about American history and politics, which I've been doing pretty much nonstop for 50 years now. It turns out the president's main job in the world is to keep a foot on the brake of the U.S. military machine. Because it's like those old cars that are poorly tuned, that though they're in neutral, they're always revving forward and they're always jumping. You take your foot off the brake, the car jumps forward. And good presidents, great presidents, have been the ones to have the foot on the brake, like Kennedy had the foot on the brake in October 1962. Johnson did not have the foot on the brake, and we escalated in Vietnam. We know that Bush, I don't even know if he was in the driver's seat, much less having a foot on the brake, but we went to so many wars. Obama was no good at this either. So this is a real question.
It's a systemic process.
It is like the game of Risk. You're always looking, we're, in Romania and Bulgaria, we're at risk unless we're also in Ukraine. So we better expand. Well, then there could be losses in the eastern Black Sea and the Caucasus. So we better expand to Georgia, et cetera, or the Solomon Islands, or what we're doing in East Asia, and just so much chit chat about war with Taiwan and U.S. war with China and Biden piping off and so forth. All of it is provocative. All of it requires actually our good luck that a president says, no, we're not going farther. Korean War, again, had MacArthur had his way, he would have invaded China. We would have used nuclear weapons at the time. Truman, his right decision, no, stop. He had to fire his top general. This is really the job of the American president, because the underlying revving machine doesn't have a natural stopping point.
Yeah, I remember I had the late Charles Johnson was a good friend of mine, and I was doing a lot of work in Japan at the time, but he was working on the books like Blowback. He wrote that trilogy about the dangers that foreshadowed the attack of 9/11. Saying if you're aggressive, you are going to have these consequences, putting the American people at risk. But let me shift, Jeff, as we're coming down the home stretch, to the relation of all of this to budget and the well-being of America. What concerns me is at the level of medical care. The OECD data shows that America per capita spends more than twice the average in the OECD to have some healthcare system that is ranked 38th in the world by the WHO. The second dimension is we have a baby boom creating a demographic bulge where elder care is going to be a priority. We are going through technological transformation that requires transforming the education system towards knowledge-intensive things. what was his name? Sir Ken Robinson, the most famous TED Talk of all time. How Schools Kill Creativity. We got to change that. That involves investment. Now we've got this military urge and climate transformation. I guess I worked on the Senate Budget Committee under Pete Domenici, and I'm thinking, how are we going to get all this stuff done if we keep playing these aggressive military games? And how are we going to harness the political economy? I always laughed. Domenici said to me one time, well, you're an economist. You know that thing called Say's Law? I said, yeah. He said, how supply creates its own demand? I said, yes, Senator. He says, well, you watch. Every year when we put up the budget, about the time that the military budgets come up, you're going to see all kinds of news about how dangerous the world is. They're using fear to create their own demand. And Adam Curtis, the BBC documentary, he created a series, a 3-part series that you can watch for free on thoughtmaybe.com, and it's called The Power of Nightmares. And so, Jeff, I'm loading you all up, but you can't sit there and be, how would I say, self-righteous budget hawk, tolerate a military-industrial complex that's spending 22 times what any other country is, neglecting older people, neglecting young people, and letting our healthcare system cost twice what it should. And with all the discord of not reconciling those things, the Bismarck playbook comes back into center stage.
Well, one of the expressions of Joe Biden that I really like, though I haven't heard it from him recently for an obvious reason. He said, don't talk to me about your values, show me your budget, and I'll tell you your values. And what he means by that is where you put your money, that's what counts in the system.
Yeah.
And the United States has really messed up the budget. It spends far too little on many areas, like education, like well-being of children. It spends far too much on other areas, like the so-called modernization of our nuclear fleet, arsenal, when we should be negotiating long-term nuclear disarmament. And in general, our budget is a mess. As you say, also, the way we organized key parts of the economy, like healthcare, is to give private monopolies to a crucial sector, ending up overpaying roughly by a factor 2 for our healthcare. We spend almost 20% of GDP on healthcare compared to roughly 10% of GDP in our peer countries. So I've written a number of books, The Price of Civilization being one of my favorites, about what a budget would look like for a civilized country. And interestingly, and one of the better parts of a speech that Secretary of State Antony Blinken just gave about U.S. Approaches to China, he said the real approach is we need to invest in ourselves. We need to strengthen our capacities in science, education, our well-being at home, because that's what makes us the competitive model vis-a-vis the rest of the world, including vis-a-vis China. And that's true, but we're not doing it. And we have lost the budget debate and the budget narrative in the last 2 years. Biden came in with the idea of a package to build back better. It did not appear. What happens in the United States is essentially key sectors are in the hands of powerful lobbies. And military-industrial complex is one of them. Big oil is another, or fossil fuel industry is another. The healthcare, private healthcare sector is a third. Those are favored by the budget. They are favored by regulation. And areas that don't have such powerful lobbies don't see the light of day. And in general, the United States under taxes, even though we're told all the time that we're being crushed by taxes, the total government revenues in the United States for federal, state, and local are about 30% of GDP, of national income. But in Northern Europe, which ranks much better in healthcare and longevity, in many quality of life indicators, about 45% of GDP. So the fact of the matter is the budget's a mess. And what foundered for Biden in the end, why didn't his package go through? Because nobody wanted to pay for it with taxation. And it all unraveled when Senator Sinema said, I don't want to have a rise of the corporate tax rate. And Manchin said, I don't like that billionaire tax. And we ended up with nothing. Biden ended up empty-handed, ineffective politics, by the way. So I think a president ought to be able to keep a couple senators in the fold, and he failed to do so. And that's part of his job also, is to know how to twist arms or cajole or give whatever side payments for new projects in West Virginia. You get something done, you make a deal, but he could not make a deal. He failed on that. So we have nothing. So we have a budget mess. And by the way, a budget mess also with a mountain of debt, now 100% of GDP of public debt. That's actually consequential. With interest rates going up, the burden of that debt is also going to be quite significant. We need to raise some taxes, and we need to restructure what we spend, but we're a blocked political system. So we are not showing a way forward on this, and I'm not holding my breath. Nothing's going to happen. Probably the Democrats are going to lose one or both houses of Congress in the fall. If that happens, I would guess there would be no significant budgetary reform or action until 2025.